Hi there, and welcome to Speaking Frankly with me, Professor Frank Joseph. We've got two really eminent guests with us today, and our podcast today is going to be slightly different from our previous ones because I'm not doing it with them in person. The wonders of technology have allowed us to do this with three of us being in three different parts of the country, and I'm very pleased to have with me two very experienced colleagues in the field of medical research. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce us to Ian, and that's Dr. Ian Smith, who is the co-founder and chief medical officer for Panthera, and also Mr. Matt Cooper, who is the general manager for the oncology division of Panthera. And Panthera are an extremely interesting organization who perform clinical trials and research in the medical world and have been on the forefront of a number of different clinical trials in different areas. I'm hoping that through our discussion today, we'll be able to delve into why participating and getting involved in clinical trials and medical research is so important, as we try and answer those important questions that are still left unanswered in so many spheres of medicine, that have conditions that still need so many solutions to try and help people live longer, fuller, and better lives. So first and foremost, I'm going to go over and start to get our two guests to introduce themselves. So Dr. Ian Smith, MBE. Ian, over to you first to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've managed to get to where you are now in your journey with clinical research.
Oh, thanks, Frank. I started life as a general practitioner in Lancashire and had this idea that it was better to run clinical trials in a dedicated environment rather than in a clinical environment. And that was really how my original business started, which was called Synexus. That business is still the biggest commercial recruiter of patients worldwide. When I retired from that about 5 years ago, along with a colleague of mine, Professor John Lyon, we decided to look at that model again, and this is where Panthera Biopartners came from, with a specific focus in looking at other diseases than we had really been specializing in Synexus.
Fantastic, Ian. Thank you for that. And Matt, over to you. So tell us a little bit about yourself. So you've had some history as well in the NIHR, haven't you?
Yeah, so I was originally a researcher, doing PhD and then postdoc research, but then moved to AstraZeneca and worked for them for a number of years in their clinical research group, running trials in primary and secondary care. And then I guess a significant chunk of my career has been with the National Institute of Health Research. So I was one of their exec directors at the Clinical Research Network, and we ran the infrastructure across England on behalf of the Department of Health in the NHS that recruited patients to both commercial and academic clinical trials. And then in more recent times, I've joined Ian and colleagues at Panthera Biopartners.
Fantastic. So I'm hoping that through your experience, we can try and give the public and the people who kind of listen to our podcast and view our podcast some insights into what really happens in the research world. I think the first question that I was going to ask was around the pandemic really was a challenging time in so many different ways, and we all acknowledge that. But it did bring to the fore the need for research in a different way, the need for research around the vaccines, the need for research around treatments for COVID, etc. And how have you seen that research journey evolve during the pandemic and post-pandemic? Are there any personal reflections from yourselves, Ian? Maybe you first.
Yeah, well, I think very much so, Frank, is the answer. Certainly, when the pandemic started and everybody realized that we needed to get vaccines developed extremely quickly, the speed of getting a clinical trial up and running in the UK went from months, sometimes even longer than that, to weeks. and that transformed the research environment, and proved that if you wanted to get studies up and running quickly, you could do it. I think our suspicion is that we will be reverting back to the previous modus operandi, in the sense that in the UK it takes quite a long time to get a clinical trial approved and recruiting patients.
And Matt, how about yourself? I mean, what have your reflections been?
I mean, I think for me, for the first time, it really highlighted clinical research and trials, and that this was actually a thing that happened in this country. It's the first time my family actually understood what it was I was doing after all these years. I think that what research was. But I think the big thing that, as Ian points out, around the COVID trials was that the research infrastructure flipped and focused solely on COVID, which in one way was fantastic for the population, fantastic for research, but it was to the detriment of all the other trials that were ongoing at the time. Yeah. And the reason we were able to focus and get trials up and running so quickly was that everything was switched just to COVID. So there were only COVID trials really that were being approved and set up during the sort of the time of the pandemic. When I was last in the NHR as part of their executive in 2018, 2019, around about 50,000 patients went on to commercial clinical trials, and that's dropped to about 28,000 now. So there's been a big decline. So I think the UK PLC really does need clinical research. It's a big driver of the economy, but it does need that focus, particularly, I guess, when you talk about these mass trials from the NHS, but also from companies like Panthera Biopartners, because we are more flexible and more agile, and we are focused solely on clinical research. I think in the NHR and the NHS, they've got an awful lot of other issues to worry about, as well as research, whereas companies like ourselves, we are focused just solely on clinical trials.
Agreed. And I mean, just from my own personal reflection, to add to the two of your comments, I think, obviously I still do NIHR-based research in the NHS. And you're right. I mean, during the pandemic, the sole focus was COVID. And it was amazing how across the NHS, because we have got, such really integrated clinical systems that allow data sharing across the NHS, large data, big population data was available. People were able to do that in kind of real time to get immediate responses to, the various interventions that helped during COVID. I mean, a good example was when dexamethasone became part of standard treatment. And just for, the lay public who listen to us, that's the steroid treatment that used to be given to people with COVID. And it all came out because there was that ability to be able to do large scale research across the NHS. But as you said, the effect that a lot of people are feeling now is that the recovery, just as there is long waiting times for elective surgery, long waiting times and the work pressures in A&E that the NHS is struggling with, the clinical trials priority is a struggle, for all of us that want to and still want to. Unfortunately, you're pulled in so many different directions trying to deal with day-to-day clinical care that it becomes difficult and challenging to be able to deliver clinical trials on the scale and pace that we were used to pre-pandemic. And even that, as Ian said before, the process, taking from, ethics and approvals and sponsors and, getting to recruitment, etc. I mean, there was delay for due diligence, I guess, to some extent, but essentially I think there were ways found to do that in a more streamlined manner during the pandemic, and hopefully some of that legacy effect will last beyond the pandemic and into the future. So let me talk to you both about where do you see the future in terms of clinical trials post-pandemic? What are the kind of focus areas? Are we still looking at vaccines? Are we going back to kind of flu vaccines now because flu is coming around? Are we still looking at COVID stuff? What are the other focus areas that you guys see evolving? Cardiovascular, obesity, liver disease, all that kind of stuff. Talk me through your experience of where things are going. Ian, maybe you first.
Well, I think you've touched on quite a few areas there, Frank, that are becoming very important. I mean, liver's a very good example. There are some brand new molecules out there to manage patients with liver disease of a kind that we hadn't even previously recognized. So this is trying to pick up people before their liver is cirrhotic and treat them to prevent cirrhosis, which, as we all know, is very, very serious, appearing. That's a pretty big area at the moment. The COVID area is interesting because, you know, there was a lot of discussion about how many hundreds of COVID vaccines were in development. We at Panthera Biopartners have not seen that. You know, now whether it's because the ones we've got are successful, and this happens in any therapy area, you know, once you've got the perfect drug for osteoarthritis, the pharmaceutical industry loses interest in trying to develop more. You know, we've seen it in osteoporosis. You know, we've got the bisphosphonates and things, and it no longer becomes commercially attractive for them to follow them up. We are doing new flu vaccine studies, but as we all know, the flu vaccine changes every year anyway, so that's an ongoing project. And there are other vaccine areas such as cytomegalovirus and respiratory syncytial virus, but they're much smaller projects than the massive COVID vaccine programs that we were all involved in.
But I think we've seen the technologies that derive the COVID vaccine now starting to spread into other areas here with these mRNA technologies.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest and most important things to do is to keep the pharmaceutical industry interested in UK as a destination to come to for clinical research. Yeah, I think it's vitally important that we still attract companies to come and place trials here. There are, the R&D machines kept churning during the COVID times at the companies. There are lots of new potential molecules out there. Sponsors are very keen to find trial sites. They want to make sure they've got sites that are going to set up quickly and efficiently and recruit to their trials, so that there's no lack of compounds across a wide variety of disease areas. What they really need is a very good, consistent approach to delivering clinical research.
So that's excellent, and I guess just in terms of what captures the public's imagination, I think people listen to research, and obviously there are certain forms of research which are what we call qualitative, which is you ask about how people feel about services, healthcare, etc. And the impact of certain treatments from that perspective. But what captures people's imagination is new molecules or compounds, as you both referred to, which is basically new medications that might be the solution to a problem that we haven't found a solution for before. Be that Alzheimer's, dementia, or be that, like Ian was saying, cirrhosis or damage to the liver. And I guess the vaccine thing is an interesting one because, as you said, Matt, the technology for vaccine development using the mRNA vaccines, is being adopted now to find vaccines for the flu, for other viruses, as Ian was talking about. So I guess that's an interesting one for people. But I guess what people don't always understand is the journey from that compound or molecule that people start with, and how long it takes them and how it goes through the process from an idea in a laboratory to actually becoming something that you can use. And I think that's probably worth spending a couple of minutes describing. And I wonder if one of you wants to pick that one up and just talk us through, people hear these things, phase 1, phase 2, preclinical, all those kind of terms. Maybe just demystify that for people a little bit so they understand it. Ian, Matt, who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll start if you like. Matt knows more about this than I do. But I think, from the general public's perspective, they probably look at the COVID vaccine program and think, oh, well, that was pretty quick, wasn't it, really? Which it was. But I think we have to remind everybody that that's not normally how it happens. A drug will go into phase 1 after it's had preclinical work done on it with animals and other modeling. And phase 1 is basically when it's given to healthy human beings. Who tend to be students, I suppose. And that's looking at, obviously, at safety, not at whether it's going to cure hypertension, but just whether the drug is actually safe or not. And then phase 2 is when you give it to a smallish number of patients, so 200 or 300. And then phase 3 is when you give it to a much, much larger number. And that's when, if there are going to be any issues, they tend to come out in the wash at that point. And that's when a decision might be made to withdraw the drug from further development. And that happens to us not frequently, but it's happened this week as it happens. Looking at a new molecule for early Alzheimer's that on Monday got withdrawn. That's why we do clinical trials, to make sure that by the time it's being given to patients, it's as safe as it can possibly be.
Yeah,
Matt, do you want to answer that?
This whole process is a highly regulated, very tried and tested process to discover new medicines from, like we say, compounds coming from a laboratory into trials, and then to a medicine that you will be given in hospital or by your GP. I think, and it's not just one trial. It's not just do one phase 1, one phase 2, and one phase 3. There are maybe multiple trials as the drug progresses, and this can take 8 to 10 years before a drug goes from first going into the first healthy volunteer through to actually being something that's been approved and signed off by the regulatory authorities as being a safe medicine. And I think the other piece around that is also then, just because it's been approved by the regulators then doesn't always mean it's going to be picked up by the healthcare providers in any particular country, because it needs to then be shown to be not just safe and effective, but it's going to be good value and cost effective in the patient population compared to other medicines or other treatments. And that's where those sort of National Institute for Clinical Excellence comes into things, and decisions are made about what medicines are going to be picked up by the NHS and what ones aren't.
I think it's hit on something there, Matt, that it's important that people realise the vast costs of getting a drug from the first thought that this might be useful to it being given to the population. You are looking at hundreds of millions of pounds. It's not a trivial exercise. And, on the basis that quite a few never make it, clearly, you could spend £500 million on the drug and then withdraw it, and you've got nothing. So I know people feel that medication is expensive, which it is. But there's a very good reason for that. It's not a trivial exercise to get a drug to the market.
And I think that's a great reflection on the process of getting a medication to be safe, effective, and utilized. I think that's the key, isn't it? At the end of the day, when you develop something, you want it to be used so that it delivers to the individuals that it's designed to help. Matt, you touched upon the safety and regulatory functions that are there. And, one of the things we always want to do is reassure people that there are so many checks and balances in place to make sure that it's done safely. There's the whole ethics thing, there's MHRA, there's all of that we have to do. And the concept of, simple things like good clinical practice, which a lot of people don't understand, but it starts with every person involved in research having to go through a course and apply principles that we call good clinical practice, where, taking consent, what we call informed consent. You inform people about the detail, you give them as much information and time to digest the information before they participate. And there are so many rules and regulations that we follow to make sure it's done safely and it's done right. And Matt and Ian, do you want to reflect a little bit on those safety processes, ethics committees, what they're made up of, who makes those decisions to let things through or not as a trial? I don't know if one of you wants to pick that one up.
Every trial that's done, in the hospital or in the GP's surgery has gone through, full approvals process, and by that we mean, it goes through ethical review. So there's a committee of individuals. These are now sort of national committees that will sign off a a study protocol as being ethically approved for the country, and they are a mix of lay people and then clinicians and researchers that will consider a protocol and see whether or not it's what they're asking a patient to do is reasonable at the end of the day, and that it's going to be in the best interest of the patient to take part in that. It's not too onerous. You're not taking liters of blood from somebody over a period of the study. That the procedures you're using are going to be good for the patient. Then on the other side of things is the regulatory approval that you talked about. So the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, is our national regulator that approves all medicines. And at the end of the day, that's the organisation that's going to look at the data that comes out from these trials to see whether the medicine that you're wanting to take forward is safe and effective to be used. So again, it's a national approval for every protocol that comes through, for every type of trial that comes through the MHRA. And then at the local level, there's all the sort of I guess industry standards that need to be applied to people doing research. So as you mentioned, good clinical practice is sort of a set of guidelines about the sort of best way to treat and care for individuals and carry out research with those individuals. And informed consent is sort of central to that. That the patient is fully aware and has been fully told about all aspects of the research that they're going to be involved in, the good, the bad. Whether there's going to be reimbursement for travel time or for their inconvenience payments to them, how many times they're going to have to come into the centre for those visits, how long they should be expected to be there, etc. And that's all in a document that the patient is given in advance of their first visit, so they have time to consider it. It's signed off by the patient alongside their clinician to say, yes, we've agreed to do that. And at any point, the patient can withdraw from that research, without any consequences to them or any future treatment that they may receive. At the end of the day, research is completely beholden to patients taking part in it. It's often a very altruistic thing for people to do, to take part in research, I guess, particularly in sort of the healthy volunteer part of things in the earlier phases. And then from the sort of point of view, I guess it's the data protection as well. So there's sort of data protection governance around that for the data that's recorded, and how the medical notes are kept and treated, and how the data's stored and analysed.
Thanks, Matt. I think it just describes the level of detail that has to be adhered to be able to do this right, and it's important people realize that a lot of care and attention goes into making this safe, appropriate, and also to some extent enjoyable. And that's the thing that I get a lot of feedback from my patients. And you talked about the altruism that people show. And I was going to ask you guys, from your experience, what are the motivators? What is it that brings people to the door and say, I want to have a go. I want to get involved. And talk to me about some of your experiences of what those motivators are. Ian, maybe?
Well, having been the principal investigator on hundreds of clinical trials, and I've interviewed thousands of patients, altruism is the thing. People will sit down in front of you and say, I'm not really doing this for me. I'm thinking it might be useful to my granddaughter or my daughter. And we've all got the medics have all got to realise that we need patients to come and help with the clinical trials that we do. Otherwise, there'll be no new medicines. And I suppose in certain therapy areas, I think probably oncology is the one that focuses the mind. If you have a tumour and you're offered participation in a clinical trial, you may be getting a new medication which is far more effective than the ones that are available on prescription. So that's another angle which is not so common if you've got, can I say, a relatively trivial condition, or a condition which is very well managed by current medications, such as high cholesterol or something like that. But altruism is the key as far as I can see.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. You touched upon the thing that, it gives you access to things that aren't around necessarily for everybody. And some people like that and want that because they may have already exhausted what's already around. I mean, I see that quite a lot in the diabetes world. You know, they've tried every other diabetic medication. They've had side effects from everything. Their diabetes isn't getting better. This is type 2 diabetes I'm talking about. And actually, they come looking because actually my doctor says that my type 2 diabetes isn't well controlled. I've tried everything. I just can't manage any of the medications given me so far. I'd like to get involved and try one of these trials, you know? And
I think there's another aspect to this which we very often forget, Frank, and that is, you know, there's lots of evidence out there that even a patient who is on a placebo does actually, amazingly, and you know, it's difficult to really explain this, but even a patient on a placebo does better than they would do if they weren't on a clinical trial. And I, you know, it's a mixture of things. I guess it's something to do with confidence in the team that's looking after you, and the fact that you're probably getting seen a lot more during a clinical trial than you would be during a normal year of follow-up for your diabetes. You know, you'd be seen maybe 6 or 8 times in a year rather than maybe just twice. But patients on placebo, interestingly, do very well.
absolutely.
The interesting thing as well is actually it's having a research active organization. Actually, the outcomes are better for all the patients in that research active organization than they are to somebody down the road that perhaps aren't doing as much research. We did, again, from the NHR point of view, because the large numbers of patients been going into trials over a number of years. They looked across the data for colorectal cancer, and Peter Selby and Matt Seymour be able to show that you know, in a hospital that was very active in colorectal cancer research, all their colorectal cancer patients did better. The outcomes were better, whether they were involved in a trial or not themselves, than hospitals down the road that weren't research active. So something about the individuals being involved in research, you know, they perhaps more aware of new techniques and more aware of what's going on in the field. You know, there's something about that. So some, you know, research active organizations, you know, are better. So research itself is a good thing to take part in for the organization, not just the patients as well.
Yeah, very interesting.
It is, and some of my patients in my sort of longer term cardiovascular outcome trials, so, you know, with diabetes medications, etc., look forward to the Christmas card I send them every year as well. But these are the things that you do, and it builds that relationship, and you don't realize that between clinical practice and actually research, because you are so much more engaged with the individual over a longer term period, sometimes you almost walk that journey a lot closer together than you do with some of the patients that you see in a clinical setting. And that relationship and the longevity of that relationship and the legacy of that relationship continues, because once you've been through one, I don't know if you find this, but people want to get involved in the next thing and the next thing because they enjoy it so much. Yeah,
of course. Yeah, we were involved in many studies around hormone replacement therapy and to a certain extent osteoporosis. And, you know, there were ladies who really were so happy with their care and attention and their regular DEXA measurements and blood measurements that they would finish a study and immediately ask, was there another one that they could join? That doesn't happen quite as much now because, you know, areas like the menopause and the management of osteoporosis, you know, there's not that much research going on in there now because we've got pretty good medication, and that's what always happens, you know.
I think there's also the challenge that there are certain Cinderella areas where, like you said, you know, there's probably not as much investment going in or pharmaceutical mileage to be had potentially, which is not a criticism. I guess, you know, as a commercial organization, pharmaceutical industries need to be able to sustain themselves and do what they do. A good example is probably antimicrobial resistance or, you know, antibiotic resistance, where, you know, there isn't a lot of drive from pharmaceutical industries to find new antibiotics, whereas, you know, the NIHR, governments are starting to invest more because they see the need for it. And that's a challenge as well, I think.
Yeah, it is.
It's interesting around that particular one, I guess, is because of resistance building up. You know, we'll develop new medicines and new antibiotics, but actually what happens is they tend to put them on the shelf and only ever use them for, you know, very serious urgent cases because they don't want that new drug, which could be the sort of the last sort of defense to be used too much. So these companies will spend an awful lot of money to develop the drug, and for it to be sort of perhaps not prescribed as much because it's being held back as sort of the last line. So I guess it's probably difficult to recoup revenues in those areas. I guess the other area is in neurology, as Ian said, sort of dementia, Alzheimer's. There's been huge amounts of research poured into that over the last sort of decade, but again, it's proven to be a very difficult place to find effective new medicines there, despite the growing need. It has been very difficult and very challenging to both, I guess, in terms of running the trials, but also developing those new molecules in that area.
And I think as we kind of take that discussion forward in terms of how what the process looks like, I think Matt, you touched upon that. There are some trials where people will have a single visit. It might just be a one-off, and you might have maybe a short-term review, which might be over a couple of months or a few months. But there are longer trials which can be over years. And I think, in terms of describing that to people, what is involved, there's fasting visits in some trials, there's, turning up at a certain time, having blood tests done, having tests done, just how would you describe what involvement looks like? I guess, that's a huge question to ask because studies and trials can be so different. But for someone who wanted to get involved, what would it look like?
I mean, they're all different shapes and sizes depending on the type of study you're doing. A vaccine study can be pretty quick. You could be in just for a few visits, or some of them might want you to keep a diary over the next sort of 6 months for symptoms, etc. Whereas and there's not much else that happens, I guess. Whereas if you're looking at oncology trial, say that this is maybe the other end of the spectrum, where you could be coming in every week for treatment for intravenous infusions. You could be having CT scans or MRI scans every month, looking for changes in the tumor and other sorts of blood tests, etc. So it really is dependent on the medicine that you're looking at. But I think the main thing is that informed consent process really looks at that right from the off. So there's no surprises to the patient. They know that when they're talking about the study, even before they're going to sign up for a trial, it's been explained in great detail to them with diagrams about what the visit schedules are going to look like. So they know what they're signing up for at the end of the day.
And I guess the other question is, what about compensation for their time? I know that they kind of, do it altruistically, but, people take time away from work. They still have to travel, take taxis, all that kind of stuff. What's the usual thing we say to people about that sort of thing, around, I guess there was a comment before about the students and why they do the phase 1 trials. And, some of it is altruism, but you occasionally hear the comment about, well, it pays good money, that I might go and do it. But that's not really the reason why most people do it. But what's that like in terms of people's time commitment and, how they're remunerated for the trouble they take and they put in as well?
It varies from trial to trial, and certainly over the 30 years that I've been involved, there are certainly a few more trials now where patients do get paid for participation. During all of my time, patients have always been paid their travel expenses and things like that. And of course, phase 1 is pretty highly paid because you would traditionally be in sort of physical isolation for 2 or 3 weeks, not going anywhere, not leaving the building. So, I mean, clearly you can't expect people to do that and not receive some compensation. There are therapy areas as well where you have to pay compensation, otherwise you'd never get those trials done. And I think one of the best examples is if you're trying to improve oral contraceptives. Women can get oral contraceptives free of charge whenever they want them. So if you want a lady to take part in an oral contraceptive study, you've got to ask the question, why would she do that? And I think that's where compensation really is essential, because otherwise there's no gain for her at all, really. She can get perfectly adequate contraception cover from her GP or family planning or whatever. So there are other reasons for, where compensation might be needed. Certainly, if you're looking at oncology, patients wouldn't expect to be paid to take part in the trial of a new breast cancer drug. They'd be more than happy to take part, obviously. So,
and again, that's all part of that ethical review. So when the ethics look at a study and a protocol, there will be a discussion around those sorts of things, because at the end of the day, they need to be, an individual needs to be going into the trial for the right reason. It shouldn't be seen as an inducement to take part in the research.
No, absolutely.
And the ethics committees are very strong around those sort of areas around that. So that there has to be a good reason for the benefit and running, sort of the efficient running of a study. It does, some studies do need some form of reimbursement for individuals.
So I think, gents, we've covered, where research started, where it's been through the pandemic, where it's going. We've covered why people get involved. I think we've kind of covered what it means to get involved, commitment. I mean, it's very different for different trials, but I think the important thing for me is hopefully we've conveyed to our viewers and listeners that actually there's so much merit, and not just for the individual, but also for healthcare at large. I mean, I guess as a physician working frontline, and Ian, you've been there as well, and Matt, you see it from an NIH perspective, all the research that is done nationally, internationally, it's all aimed at trying to find more solutions, more treatments, more things that will help people prevent, cure, conditions, ailments, diseases that we struggle with, and keep people alive and well for longer. And that's what the aim of research is at the end of the day. And I guess the final thing we want to be able to tell people is, well, if you are motivated to get involved, how do you get involved? Where do you go and look? Which door do you knock on to say, I want to get involved, what do I do? Any ideas on how you might signpost people? Where would you send people to get involved?
Well, you would either go on to something like the Panthera website, where there's a patient section, you can register an interest, and there are one or two other groups that have that as well. Sad to say, the majority of GPs don't take part in clinical research. So, if you've got a GP who's involved, then you can ask the practice, if there's anything that they're doing. I mean, Matt, you'll know this better than me, but I mean, what percentage of GPs actually get involved in clinical research?
It's a relatively small number. I think they ran nationally a campaign aimed at the patients and the public around it's okay to ask, and it's about empowering patients that when you go and see your GP, your consultant in hospital, that you should have the right to say, I'm interested in research. Are you running any trials in this disease? If you are, could you signpost me to a trial? If you're not, do you know any of your colleagues locally that are, or how can I get involved in research in this particular disease area? It shouldn't be the doctors, being the gatekeepers to access to research.
Correct.
It does need to be the public being aware that there's research, and I think, as we've discussed, people are far more aware now about clinical trials and clinical research than they ever used to be. And then it's about them being able to access resources. There are online resources around, sort of Find Me Cure, I think one is called. The NHR have got a website where you can look at for trials. There are the companies like Panthera that are running research in particular areas. I think a bit of searching on the internet will probably fish out a few options. But it does need to be easier to access through your healthcare journey, as it were, rather than the patient having to do a lot of the legwork. Maybe you'll hear advertisements on local radio or Facebook, or certainly we advertise trials on social media.
Fantastic. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you to both Ian and Matt for an excellent discussion. Hopefully what we've done is helped guide some of our viewers and listeners through the journey of research, what happens behind the scenes, what would happen if they wanted to get involved, And hopefully with the conversation today, we've motivated a few people to want to get involved in research. So please speak to your GP, your local health provider, look up, the websites that we've talked about and look for trials that are happening. And it's one great way to contribute, because at the end of the day, it is only through participating and contributing to clinical trials and medical research are we ever going to find newer treatments, newer solutions to keep progressing in medical science and technology. So I'm going to say a big thank you to Ian and to Matt for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Very nice. Thank you very much.